Chapter 11, Section 3 now, non-Mendelian inheritance. So we've been talking about Mendelian genetics, the inheritance of these dominant and recessive traits, in which you have two forms of the trait again, a dominant form and a recessive form. There are many traits for which that situation applies, but there are some where that situation doesn't apply. That is, we have some forms of non-Mendelian inheritance where they don't adhere to the simple two allele dominant recessive situation. For example, we can have what's termed incomplete dominance. And with incomplete dominance, if we look here, we have this reddish flower and whitish flower. These are the same species, two different forms. And when you cross these individuals, you generate heterozygotes. And notice for the gene, this is the same gene. They're just labeling one allele as R, R, and one is W. So when you get the heterozygotes, they're neither white nor red, but they're pink. This is what we call incomplete dominance. That is, neither allele is dominant to the other. And in incomplete dominance, in the heterozygotes, you often get a phenotype that is different from either parent. In this case, it's a combination of the red and the white. So that's sort of a hallmark of incomplete dominance, is when the heterozygote has a phenotype that's different from either parent. Now, as you can imagine, if we take two of these heterozygotes and cross them, we will regenerate some of the red individuals and some of the white individuals in the next generation. All right, codominance. Here's a situation where, let's look at this. Here in these chickens, we have a gene that's responsible for feather color, and they're calling it the F gene. And notice with this notation, they're giving them a superscript. That is, you have feather color for a gene, an allele for feather color that's black, and an allele for feather color that's white. So if we cross a individual that's homozygous for black here, you notice, or homozygous for the B gene, and here that's homozygous for the white, what do we get in the offspring? Well, we get heterozygous individuals, FB, FW, but what are they? They are both black and white. They're not gray, they're not black, they're not white, they're black and white. This is an example of codominance, where the genes, the two forms of the gene, the two alleles, are equally dominant. They are codominant. You're welcome to look up what's called roan coat, which is a common coloration in horses. It's another example of codominance where the horses have basically sort of brown, reddish brown hairs and white hairs. And in the heterozygotes, what are they? They're basically horses that have they have both brown hairs and white hairs. It's not some intermediate look. It's brown hairs and white hairs mixed throughout the horse. Excuse me, so that's codominance. Now, sometimes as well, we have a situation where for a given gene, we have more than two alleles. So up till now, we've been keeping it kind of simple and say you've got this dominant and this recessive gene, or allele. So you've just got two forms of the given gene. Well, sometimes you can have more than two forms, more than two alleles. Now, you can't have more than two in any one individual because each individual only has two copies. But when we look at a whole group of individuals, a whole population, there are some genes where you have more than two alleles. A good example of that is with blood types. Because with blood types, we have three alleles, the A, the B, and the O. And you can get, as you see here, any of these six combinations, AA, AO, BB, BO, AB, or OO. Those are the six combinations of those three alleles. Now notice, these two genotypes give you A-type blood. These two genotypes give you B-type blood. This genotype gives us what we call AB blood, not A, not B, but AB. And this genotype gives us the O phenotype. So what does this tell us about the nature or the relationship between these different alleles? Well, what do you notice? Of course, A is dominant to O, because if you're AO, you have A-type blood. B is dominant to O, because if you have the combination BO, you have B-type blood. What about A and B? A and B are basically codominant. In the heterozygote here, they are both expressed. You have AB type blood. And what's O? O is the recessive allele in this situation. In order to have O-type blood, you have to have 2 copies of the O allele. All right, so blood types shows us a couple things. Again, for any given gene, you can sometimes have more than 2 alleles. And within the blood types, we see dominance and recessive. A and B are dominant to O. But we also see codominance of A and B. All right, and now some traits, the ones we've been talking to up till now, are due to a single gene. Okay, there's a single gene that influences blood type. There's a single gene that influences the flower color in pea plants or the seed shape in pea plants. But there are traits that are due to more than one gene. Okay, often they're due to several genes. And so in our image here, we have these people who are lined up by their height. And so you notice you've got quite a range from relatively short individuals who are 5 foot tall over here to some few individuals who are 6'5", and of course quite a few in between. So height, we would say, is not a discrete characteristic like flower color in pea plants. With the pea plants, you're either purple or you're white. But with height, you've got short individuals, tall individuals, and everything in between. Okay? So these polygenic or multi-gene traits fall on a continuum. Again, they're not discrete traits, but they fall on a continuum. And that continuum often has this sort of shape, where in terms of the number of individuals falling on the continuum, you have relatively few at one end, relatively few at the other end, and a lot in between. Typically, not always, but typically that's the way these polygenic traits fall out on the continuum. So in addition to height, what other kinds of things? Skin tone is another polygenic trait as well. You have some individuals who have very dark skin, some very individuals with very light skin, and a lot of people in between. And with this image, it's showing us how you can have multiple genes, in this case 3 genes, the A, the B, and the C gene. And this is not exactly how skin color works, but this is just for an argument's sake. You've got these 3 genes, and if you happen to have all 6 of those alleles, big A, big B, big C, then you'll have the darker skin. Whereas if you have all recessives, little a, little B, little C, you'll have a very light skin tone. And then when you have all the possible combinations in between, that's what gives you the variation in skin tone, and this trait that generally falls on a continuum, not with discrete skin tones. What other kinds of things? Of course, body weight is clearly a polygenic trait. There's not just one gene that determines your body weight. We've talked about skin tone, height. What else can you think of? Probably other things like hair color. All right, you have individuals with very dark hair and other individuals with very light hair and everything in between. Now, one thing you should keep in mind with these polygenic traits, they are traits that are almost always to some degree influenced by the environment. So they have a genetic component, but an environmental component. So think of skin tone. You have a genetic predisposition to have a certain skin tone, but if you go stand outside in the sun for a while, doesn't matter what your skin tone is, it'll tend to get darker or at least redder if you burn. So that's a case of where the environment influences the phenotype, the expression of that combination of genes that you have. Think body weight as well. You may have a genetic predisposition for a certain body weight. Of course, if you starve yourself, you'll lose weight, and if you eat a whole bunch of food, you'll gain weight. So you can modify that phenotype by, again, your quote environment. Obviously, you can do that with hair color if you dye it, but also if you just stay out in the sun a long time, it tends to lighten your hair up a little bit as well. Um, Here's an example of the book of these butterflies, and they are a population of butterflies where individuals hatch out at different times of the year. Some are hatching out early in the spring, some later in the spring, some in the later in the summer. And individuals within the population can have the same genotype, but that genotype can be expressed in a different way depending upon when they hatch out. When they hatch out earlier, they tend to be darker, and when they hatch out later, they tend to be lighter. And why is that? Well, because the butterflies need to have a certain body temperature to be warm enough to fly. And in the springtime, of course, it tends to be a little cooler. And so what happens is in the spring, the darker ones tend to hatch out because then they can sit in the sun and that darker wing color will absorb sunlight and it will warm them up. Whereas in the summertime, you don't need that extra help warming up, so you tend to be individuals that have the lighter colored wings so you don't get overly hot. So again, same genotype, but it can be expressed in different ways depending upon the time of year that they hatch out. Okay, so there is section 3.